We're living in a unique time in the church. We've been told we can't meet together the way we ordinarily would, and there has suddenly been a influx of new online material as churches are seeking to use the new technologies of today to enable them to operate as Christians. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'd like to do today is make a series of short videos on how we as Christians should be viewing the situation that we're in and the use of technology in this situation. What right do I have to talk about this subject? Well, first of all, I have qualifications in media. I have an NC in media production and an HND in television operations and productions. I have 2 years of running my own YouTube channel, not Christian based. I volunteered on a number of other external projects, and I've actually had footage that I've filmed appear on the BBC and ITV News. There are three basic subjects that I wish to look at during these studies. The first subject I want to look at is the church online. How does the Bible view that, and how should we view the church and new media, shall we say? The second thing I want to look at is consuming online material as a Christian. Okay, so I'm not thinking about general world media, I'm thinking more about Christian based media. Finally, I would like to look at how we produce as a church or as Christians media for particularly videos for our church and for gospel outreach and for teaching. What I'd like to look at first is the Bible's view of a church and how we can use a technology that did not exist when the church was first implemented or first spoken about and understand God's view in light of this current situation. What I'd like to do is, first of all, look at how the Bible thinks of a church and how this impacts us at the moment with regards to the technology that we have access to. I think probably the key point when looking at this subject is what constitutes a church gathering. There are certain roles and rules and responsibilities in a church gathering that don't necessarily apply elsewhere. Probably the key verse to look at when identifying what is and more importantly what is not a church gathering is Matthew chapter 18 and verse 21. Probably one of the best known verses for a church. Where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. The first little part of that's quite simple. Where two or three, it's a number. Two people, two Christians meeting together. But that doesn't mean that every time two Christians meet together, it constitutes a church gathering. You know, if I was to meet another Christian walking down the street, we would not say that church rules must apply there. I think we could agree on that. Because there's a condition. It's in my name. We must be gathering in the name of Jesus in order for church rules to apply. Also, the suggestion of the original Greek is that they had been gathering together and they were intending to continue gathering together. And here we run into the point where people might diverge on this. People might say, well, the church is electronically gathering together and therefore church rules should apply. I'm not as convinced on that. When looking at a number of other verses, it always talks about being together, gathering together, meeting together. And I'm not convinced that digitally that's the same thing. I would suggest that it opens up dangerous futures if we were to consider online gatherings as being truly a church. Where do we draw the line then after this situation? Does that mean that people don't need to leave their house in order to be part of the church? And you think, well, maybe that's a good thing. It would allow older people or infirm people to come and gather as part of the church. But there is a lacking there, I feel, for the future. There is a suggestion of fellowship being one of the fundamental purposes of a church. And if we don't have fellowship, true physical contact level of fellowship, the church is going to be lacking. So if this does not constitute a church, if being online does not constitute a church, does that mean that we should abandon all online activities and simply return back to our churches despite what the government has stipulated? Well, I would suggest that's not a biblical way of operating either. The Bible in Romans 13 and verse 1 and in 1 Timothy 2 and verses 1 and 2 would indicate that we ought to be obeying the powers that be, the authority that God has put over us. And so although we may not like the situation that we're in, nevertheless it's God that has put us here. I think were we to fail to obey the government guidance and simply return to our church services as we normally would, I think that we risk damaging the testimony of the church to which we belong. So if we're saying that these are not church gatherings, what can we use this online technology for? Well, first of all, I'd like to say something that I don't think it should be used for. I don't think it should be used for the Lord's Supper or communion or the breaking of bread or however you want to put it. I think that is something that can only really be done in person. And when you look at how the feast was instituted, you look at how it is recorded in the New Testament as being held, it is not something that we can do online with whatever bread and grape juice or wine we have in the house. So what about fellowship? What about spending time with one another? There's an expectation in Christianity for care and for love one for another. We should be interested in each other, looking after one another. And this is something that we can do in the lockdown situation. We can still contact each other by phone, by email, by video conference, and talk to one another, either one-to-one or as a group. Those of you that have tried to do this will probably find that it's more difficult doing that online than it is in person, but if that's all we can do, then I think that is appropriate. So what about prayer? Well, I see no problem praying on a video conference or a phone call, one with another. I know people that did that before the lockdown. I know people that will continue to do that after the lockdown. I don't think we need to treat it as a church gathering, as I've already said, but it is something that we can do. Ministry. So we've spoken about the Lord's Supper, we've spoken about prayer and fellowship, but what about other things? What about outreach? Well, I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to look at our digital outreach, and we'll talk about that in a future video, how we do that, how we could be approaching that as a problem. I think we could look at teaching and encouragement for Christians in this time when they don't have access to those resources they would normally be having access to in a church. I think that as this is not a church gathering, the requirements on a lady are different. There is no necessity for wearing a head covering, nor for remaining silent in these online events.